If I could ask everyone to please find their seats. I have the privilege of introducing our closing keynote speaker, Chris Painter, whom all of you know is the current director of cybersecurity and actually the acting cyber czar at the National Security Council. Chris, it's been many hours of very in-depth discussion, and we all know you're coming here with all the answers. So you've got the tough job of having to finish what was a very robust day of discussion, but I couldn't think of a better person, someone who's not only better informed, but also someone who has looked at these issues over so many years. Chris is no stranger to cybersecurity. Before he came to the White House, he had also served as a prosecutor, a federal prosecutor in Los Angeles. He prosecuted arguably the most infamous hacker in history, Kevin Mitnick. I might add, had to do so as not only a Paul Revere, but to some extent a MacGyver. You were having to work with, you were prosecuting 21st century crimes when in reality at that time we really were looking at 18th century laws to be able to address some of those issues. So I think you used very unique skills to be able to prosecute these cases successfully. He's also served the Department of Justice, was also responsible for the prosecution of Mafia Boy, if you remember the first major distributed denial of service attack, and has served for many years as the chairman of the G8 High-Tech Crimes Division. Chris, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for taking the time, and especially for rearranging your schedule to be able to accommodate us. Thank you.
Okay, first, it's not a czar, it's a coordinator. And second, I actually have been, well, the alliteration is with a C. I have been able to watch a lot of this during the day on the internet, and I've noticed a lot of times you all speak very well, but occasionally you freeze up, and they have to be refreshed. So if I stop in the middle of my talk, just refresh. What I want to do today is I want to talk a little bit about something many of you obviously are familiar with, but I want to talk a little bit about the President's speech, the President's vision, the threat that's out there, although many of you today have covered this. And I'm going to be brief today because you have heard many of the things that I'm going to say have been said by many other people in different contexts, but I want to try to bring it together. And talk about the threat a little bit, talk about the President's speech and the cyber review, and then really talk about the various short-term action items and how they fit in, I believe, into a deterrence framework, and I think that they do. And really, as you look at deterrence as an organizing principle for a strategy and for how we're going forward, and really in all the different things we're doing, as I think several of the panelists in different panels today pointed out, I think that's a good kind of organizing principle to think about this in. The threat, the President in his landmark speech back in May said first, and I think this is self-evident to everyone here, that America's economic growth in the 21st century and our prosperity is dependent on good cybersecurity. And he said that it's a great irony of the information age that the key technologies that empower us to create and to build also empower those who would disrupt and destroy. And what he did then is, as you recall, he went through a number of the different threat vectors we're facing. He talked about, for instance, the ATM case where a transnational organized crime group in a very synchronized way was able to hit ATMs all over the globe. He talked about the fact that his own campaign was the victim of a cyber threat. He talked about some of the other threats that we're facing, including some of the things like some of the cyber warfare, quote-unquote warfare, that took place in Georgia. And so he talked about the whole threat landscape. And when I think about this, and I heard Steve Chabinsky say this in the last panel, the threat is it's a broad spectrum threat. It's not just the outsider threat or the remote cyber threat that a lot of people on the outside, I think of this issue in. It's really an integrated series of threats. It's that remote threat of people breaking into networks, and we've seen that all kinds of threat actors involved in that. It's a supply chain operations threat. How do you really deal with that issue? It's close access operations where people are actually getting close to networks, and there are good criminal examples of this. You remember years ago there was something called, there was a Lowe's case where the Lowe's stores had a group of wireless hackers who were going outside and camping outside their stores and getting access to some of their payment processing information and stealing all these credit card numbers. So that's done in that sphere, but it's done by all kinds of threat actors. There's insiders, and there's been lots of different insider cases, including insiders who plant logic bombs at computers that can cause damage. And again, that is not just that threat actor, but across the way. And there's those who get into facilities to plant malicious software. So there's a whole range of different kinds of things when we talk about what the threat is. And in my own experience, as I said, I started doing this back in 1991, and back then there was not a lot of people who thought that this was really a big issue, and a lot of the people who were, first of all, society wasn't nearly as dependent on computers and computer networks as they are today. The internet was really in its infancy in a lot of ways. People weren't using it to communicate, to do business, to do financial transactions. Companies weren't really storing their life's blood, their companies and their trade secrets on their computer networks as much. Some were. And the people who would attack those systems were usually those who did it often just to prove that they could show that they had the capability, but beyond that they really weren't thinking in an organized way about what the damage would be. And then you fast forward over those 20 years, and this, one of the amazing things about this is that the cleverness and the new forms of attack we see really change every single year, if not really every single week. And so you look over that entire time, you see a number of things happen. One, you see the rise of transnational organized criminal groups who are very organized, and the president cited one example of that. And they're doing this expressly for money, and they're really organized very much like traditional OC groups, organized crime groups. They have cells, they have capos, they have capo de capos, they have runners, but they're all over the globe, and they don't never actually physically meet each other. You've had the evolution of, like, for instance, the Mafia Boy case, which was someone who was a Canadian teenager who hit all these high-profile e-commerce sites back in 2000, when we were all worried about the Y2K bug shortly after that. But now you have a lot of people involved in bot herding. Bots have become the Swiss Army knife for all kinds of things, from identity theft to spam to denial of service attack cases. And you have people who are creating bots and then selling them on the internet to the highest bidder for extortion and for any other purpose. So you had a real evolution there. You had the growth of nation states, espionage, terrorists, although I think, as was correctly pointed out by several panels today, the terrorists have used the internet more to communicate than to attack, but they certainly are interested in that capability. So you've had this real evolution of the threat so that we see it in our everyday lives. Fortunately, I think, too, as that has occurred, that I think the public, certainly businesses, and now certainly government, have more and more understood that this really is a threat. This is something we need to deal with, and this really is something that undergirds, the cyber infrastructure is something that undergirds everything that we do, and we need to protect it. So that led the president to say back in May that it is clear that the cyber threat is one of the most serious economic and national security challenges we face as a nation. And he then said, and I think this is also, everything he said in that speech I think was exceptionally significant when you think about it, having a world leader and our president making a speech like this set a great signal not just to the U.S. but around the world that this is something the U.S. takes seriously. He said, from now on, our digital infrastructure, the networks and computers we depend on every day, will be treated as they should be, as a strategic national asset. Protecting this infrastructure will be a national security priority. We will ensure that these networks are secure, trustworthy, and resilient. We will deter, prevent, detect, and defend against attacks and recover quickly from any disruptions or damage. Obviously, it's a huge order, and that conclusion arose out of, as many of you know, a report that the president commissioned when getting into office to do a review of all U.S. cyber security policy. And we produced that report, and he released it at the time he gave that speech. And I won't talk a lot about the report because I think many of you read it, but I want to start and maybe frame it a little bit by talking about the definition that we use for cybersecurity in that report, because I think, as I heard a lot of the discussion today, it was striking that people have broken out of the sense that cybersecurity means just the kind of protection of the networks, especially in the Deterrence Conference, this makes sense, but a lot of people still think of cybersecurity as just hardening the targets, and it's vastly more than that. So when we, in the cyberspace policy review, define cybersecurity, it says, and it's telling by how long this definition is, includes strategy, policy, and standards regarding the security of and operations in cyberspace. It encompasses the full range of threat reduction, vulnerability reduction, deterrence, international engagement, incident response, resiliency, and recovery policies and activities, including computer network operations, information assurance, law enforcement, diplomacy, military, and intelligence missions as they relate to the security and stability of the global information and communications infrastructure. Obviously, that's a hugely broad definition, but it's an appropriately broad definition given all the different aspects that we must address when we're trying to have a policy and implementation that really heightens cybersecurity. So for today's speech, I thought what I would do is talk about some of the things that are in the short-term recommendations. The report both produced a 38-page report and some annexes that talked about various issues in this area. But we also, in that report, set out a set of 10 near-term recommendations, and then I think it was 14 mid-term recommendations that have been guiding what we've done since the President made that speech. And there's been a lot of activity around those. But I think if you think about it, deterrence can be a great organizing principle for thinking about that. When we talk about deterrence, and I've heard different people during the day use different formulations for it, but the formulation that I'll use is that it's raising the cost for the adversary, either making it more difficult for him or he's not going to get as much as he thought he was, but also making sure there are consequences too. So it's costs and consequences. And when you think about that formula, or really any of the formulas I heard today, I think you can fit what we are doing appropriately in that rubric. Now, when we talk about deterrence, there are a number of aspects of deterrence. One is making stronger, more resilient defenses. And I've heard several of the panels discuss that today. The second is improved intelligence collection and information collection really, and investigative capabilities. And that's an aspect of response. Having credible response capabilities that make diplomatic, economic, law enforcement, cyber, and other responses actually credible and understood. Increased international engagement. I've heard several people talk about that today, and I'll talk about it too, to establish things like norms of behavior, foster cooperation against cybercrime, foster a cooperation in terms of hardening the targets and having certs and other things out there that protects infrastructures not just in the U.S. but around the world, and a public discussion that involves some of these things and what we are doing and what where we think we want to go here, so people understand both what the risk is to themselves and what we need to do to protect ourselves. So if those are some of the key elements, which really range from everything from preventative actions to resilience to response. Everything, as I said, fits within that and should fit within that organizing principle. One aspect of all of this is having increased government willingness to address these issues, and that started under the Comprehensive National Cyber Initiative that you heard about before. And you'll notice that one of the things that was said in the short-term recommendations is that we are building on that CNCI, building on that beginning to really kind of move forward and even go further than that effort, which was a huge effort when. And the important thing there is, is the interagency collaboration. I think collaboration is really a good term. I think in the entire time I've been involved in this, I've seen the interagency coming together more and more in the last year and a half, and even more in the last few months, where the agency players are coming around the table, they're discussing all these issues, they're willingly contributing both their resources, their time, and their thought power to make sure that we can deliver on the President's agenda, and that's critically important. I think, this is a team sport in a lot of ways. Each agency has some core responsibilities, core authorities, and core capabilities, and you're not going to succeed if you don't harness all of those together and really coordinate them so that we are pulling together. And it's not just, as all of you know, it's not just the federal agencies alone. It is working with the private sector. I don't know where 85% comes from. I don't know what the right number is. I know the vast amount of the infrastructure is owned by the private sector. I think that's absolutely true. But too often, I think in the past, the kind of relationship we've had with the private sector has been mostly just discussions. And discussions are good. It builds trust. It builds relationships. But one of the things we said in the report that was necessary is to take that to the next level so that there was actionable information that could be used both by the private sector and the government in return. And we're working on trying to build that relationship. So I see that more and more, and I'll discuss some of the aspects where I've seen that being incorporated. In all of these things, we have a lot more to do, and we realize that. But this is a sustained, long-term effort that we're undertaking. So to go and just talk briefly about some of these. One is, the second of the near-term recommendations was to prepare an updated national strategy to secure the information and communications infrastructure that built upon the CNCI, as I mentioned before. And that's precisely what we're doing. And when you think about deterrence as an organizing principle again, you have resilience, you have response, you have preparedness, you have what kinds of things you can do in information sharing to undergird this, what kinds of things you can do in terms of law enforcement and other capacities, what your international environment is going to be. Those are all part of that strategy, and appropriately so. Another one of the short-term recommendations was to designate a civil liberties and privacy person. We've done that. And one of the things I heard Assistant Secretary Knox say this morning from his speech was that what we need to make sure of, and this is absolutely true, is that we are as transparent as possible and we're engaging with the civil liberties and privacy community, which we've been doing. And I think that helps us succeed and helps really us understand what the different aspects of this are. Everything from the security aspect to the civil liberties and privacy aspect to the private sector aspect have to be integrated together. Another thing that we talked about was convening a legal group to decide some of the threshold legal issues, and there are a lot of them. I think we mentioned before that there are at least over 40 legal issues, threshold illegal issues that need to be resolved, but one key thing, obviously, as again has been discussed during the day, is what use of force means in cyberspace. How does that apply, and when does that trigger the right to self-defense? So those kind of issues, I think, are all being looked at, and appropriately so. We talked about having a national public awareness and education campaign. That's really kind of two recommendations if you think about it. It's the awareness and education, which are similar, but they're a little bit distinct too. On the education front, we're really working toward an education strategy. It's dealing with K through 12, it's dealing with high school, it's dealing with educating the higher level workforce to make sure both the public and private sector has people in the pipeline to fill it. On cybersecurity awareness, I heard one speaker this morning saying he didn't feel any more aware after this last month, but I will tell you that this was, in my experience, the most successful cybersecurity awareness month ever. We had the president did a video, which again, this is unheard of for the president to do, a 3.5-minute video to tell people to secure themselves. And that really, I think, helps translate and get it out there to the public, where it has to be just kind of an article of everyday faith, something you think about every day. So that was good. You had lots of different events that went on. You had lots of blogs and other things that were occurring. And really, I think it did help raise awareness. Is it over? No, because one of the key things with awareness is you can't make it just for a month or a week or a day. You have to have that sustained effort all year round. And that requires getting into people's mind that they understand that this is a risk themselves. So part of it is telling them what the threat is so that they can actually take action to protect themselves. But part of it is just thinking about cybersecurity as an everyday matter. How does that help deterrence? Well, again, if you make the target harder to hit, if you make people secure their own systems, including businesses, then that helps deterrence, because classical deterrence is if you make it more difficult to get in. And I heard one speaker say that deterrence wouldn't apply because you can never have 100% prevention. Well, maybe not, but you don't need 100% prevention for deterrence to apply. That's one aspect, and you have to do as much as you can to harden those targets and have that preventative system. Then you have to have, as I think you mentioned, the resiliency. You have to make sure that you can bounce back from these things, and then you have to have the appropriate response. So, I'm heartened by what happened in the awareness campaign this last time. It's something we're not going to let up on, and DHS is not going to let up on, and other agencies either. Another thing we talked about is again a kind of a dual level effort. It's preparing a comprehensive incident response plan, and within and outside of that, information sharing, better information sharing. So I've talked about information sharing a little bit, and that's not just information sharing between the private sector, between the government, and between the government and the private sector. It's all three of those. So those all have to be improved, and we're working on that. one aspect of doing that, though, is to have an incident response plan that actually makes sense and works. We have to, in a way, we've gone down this path before. We've had other iterations of trying to do incident response, but without a real comprehensive incident response plan that includes the private sector as well as the government, we're not going to be prepared. So if you think about the aspects of incident response, it's incident response for the government, it's incident response in the private sector, it's incident response in dealing with our international partners, and you have to have all of those across the board. And we are doing quite a bit there. For instance, you heard from Phil about the new center that had the ribbon cutting on Friday that brought some of the DHS components together. There are lots of other capabilities out there. There's the NCIJTF that the FBI runs, but has 18 agencies, I think, at it now. There's the NTOC. There is just a lot of different capabilities that are coming together throughout the government to do that, and that's important. But they've been leading an incident response planning framework with the private sector deeply engaged over the last several months. That's something that's going to be critically important for us all. And part of that, I think, in the long term is when you have that plan in place, you test that plan, you exercise that plan, and part of it involves having playbooks. So you can go, look, it would be difficult to do a playbook for every single possible cyber incident that can happen, but you can be more prepared in thinking about what the general contours are and how you respond and how you work with each other. And I think that's going to be important too. We talked about one of the recommendations, 9, was research and development and game-changing technology. So when we're talking about two different things that we're talking a lot about today, one was protecting systems. So if you have real game-changing technology that can help protect the systems, that is key, and we have to put our resources in that. And the second is, working to help things like attribution. I mean, I think that could be another place where some of the research and development can give us some answers. But the other thing about research and development that's key, critically important here, is that as we develop these new technologies, as we think about new innovations that are out there, we can make sure security is built in at the front end and not baked on after the fact, or added on at the fact. It's baked in and not added on. And that not only saves you money, but it really makes you more secure overall as well. The 10th thing we talked about in the report was an identity management vision. And this, again, I think helps a deterrence, an overall deterrence strategy, because if you empower people to protect themselves by having a authentication scheme that protects privacy at the same time, they're able to protect their data, and that reduces a lot of the noise in the system, so you really see the more sophisticated attacks, and you get rid of a lot of the ones that are hitting us every day, a lot of the criminal attacks, and I think that will help too. And then finally, and I think a lot of people have talked about this today too, is coming up with our international strategy and talking to our international partners and prioritizing the international issues, both in terms of issues and fora. And that is a key recommendation in the report. We had a section in the report that talked about international issues. We all know we're not alone in this. We know that even as the private sector, that many of the companies are multinational companies, that they have to share information internationally. We know that we have to reach out beyond just our traditional allies. I think I heard Neil say that we have to go beyond the Five Eyes, and we certainly have to talk to the Five Eyes, but go beyond that and talk to other partners around the world. And we have to engage in the forums that are now looking at cybersecurity as a critical issue. And there are lots of them, because this has become an issue that's on everyone's mind now. So how do you make sure that that is channeled in a way that I think helps all of us get to where we need to be? And I think we've had real progress there too. We've been talking to a lot of our international allies, we've been talking to other countries, and we've been talking within the U.S. government and with the private sector about what our priorities should be. What can we do to advance things like legal structures? That was talked about in one of the panels, some of the core, both criminal law and other legal structures. How can we advance things like having certs around the world? How can we make sure there's good cooperation between countries and information sharing among countries? How can we get everyone to understand that this is something we all need to protect together? And I think we're making substantial progress there. We have a long way to go there. I've been doing international issues for a long time now within the G8 framework, and we made some progress, but we have a long way to go. So, if I look at all of that, I guess the one takeaway point I like to leave people with is that, many of the issues that we've discussed today have been, we've been discussing these for at least as long as I can remember. I mean, a lot of these issues are recurrent issues. They're not easy issues. The fact they're not easy issues doesn't mean we shouldn't try to resolve them. And I think, today, and it's conversations like the ones that happen today, but certainly today the willingness at the White House and the federal government is to address these issues, to actually try to figure out what the answers are and to move forward, both in terms of addressing what the policy issues are, but also doing some of the implementation, like strengthening these centers, like strengthening DHS, like working with Justice and all the other agencies who have capabilities, and DOD and others in this area, to bring together. So, and I've been doing this, as I said, for a long, long time. And I've seen kind of ebbs and flows in various cybersecurity aspects and approaches. But I think we're at a really great time now because not just high-level attention in the government and in industry and the public sector and internationally, I think those are all coming together. And I think it gives us, in my view at least, the biggest opportunity we've ever had to make sustained progress in this area. So I'm lucky to be part of that. I'm lucky to be here with all of you. I'm sure we'll talk much more about this, and this is not something that's a single step or a single day, but it's going to be a sustained effort for a number of years that we're going to have to do together. So,
Chris, thank you. Thank you so much. We have time for a couple of questions, and I know you've got a trip to Charlottesville you got to get to.
We had a panelist today talking about the legislative side of government, public bills, and some state process, Congress, some of which are very precarious. Can you give us any perspective by us how you see that
Well, we're looking at, I'm not going to comment on any particular piece of legislation, sorry, but we are looking at all the bills that are out there. We're talking to the various agencies about the bills that are out there. And we're going to certainly be working with Congress on them. So beyond that, I can't give you any definite, but I can tell you that all of those bills are known to us. We're looking at them. The interagencies were looking at them, and we're formulating some opinions. Not just what the bills cover, but also if there are gaps that are not addressed by those bills, and then we can go forward with.
I applaud, my name's Art Kendall. I applaud that you're looking at the privacy and civil rights. But I find looking at the whole family of human rights, particularly since it's under Section 27 of the Universal Declaration and 15 of the Minnesota Amendment, to the rights to advancement of science, and that certain regulatory restrictions could interfere with the rights. I suppose it would be have in mind even besides the civil and political rights, even social and economic rights.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, I mean, particularly, we want to promote innovation in this area. So we want to be very careful when we're doing that we're not stymieing innovation as we talk about security. So that's one of the aspects we'll be looking at.
Got time for two. Ellen, Richard, Susan. Quick questions.
Well, on the second question, well, I can take it in either order. Cyber Command is being stood up, as Secretary Knox said. It has, its purpose, and this is what DoD should be doing, is organizing to better to protect the .mil systems. It is part of an overall government strategy. So Cyber Command and DoD's activities are part. DHS, who you heard about from Phil Reitinger, is part. DOJ is part, and what the FBI is doing with Steve Cheminsky said. And that's all being weaved together. So that's all of those things are being discussed in interagency committees in terms of coordination. as that develops more, we'll hear more of that. So then that's one. Two, on the international front, I think there are a lot of countries around the world we need to engage in this, and we need to find out, what they're thinking about things and and how they may differ from us in those approaches. But I think we're going to have conversations with lots of different countries in different forums. Some of the forums might include a bunch of different countries, multilateral forums. So again, it'd be one of these watch these space things where we can talk more about that in the future.
Steve, can I just tag on one little rider to that question? Do you think that there's the need to build on existing organizations, many of which have had many years of success? Take NATO, take the Five Eyes. There's a reason we look to them because there's many years of cooperation in a very discrete field. Or do you think that there's the need to bring other disciplines into a new discipline that has a bit of a cyber focus? For example, you have Cyber Command, which is, you've got air, land, sea, space. Do you see the need for an international organization, a G50 or an E50 or whatever it may be, or is
I
it
think
both?
right now, I think right now there are a lot of international organizations that are already in this space. So we need to address what are the core capabilities of those organizations. And I think, the other thing we need to do is there are a lot of organizations that don't ordinarily deal with cyber issues. But cyber issues come up just like they do in the innovation agenda. And we want to make sure that that message gets conveyed to those bodies that more traditionally don't deal with that.
Richard, you've got the last one. Suzanne.
My question actually was very similar to those two. I wanted to know if you've given any thought what sort of international structures you might use to try and develop this sort of dialogue that stays beyond the Five Eyes.
I think I sort of already answered that. We are looking at all those different alternatives now, and which are doing what things and kind of cataloging them and figuring out what the best opportunities are for us, not just for us, but for our partners as well.
Chris, I'm going to let you go to
Okay, good. Thank
On
you.
that note, Chris, on behalf of everyone here, let me thank you. Let me leave you with and also thank you for all you do every day and raising awareness.
Well, and the last thing I'll say is it's not just me. It's a real dedicated group of people at the White House and really throughout the federal government that are doing these things. And they're really making all this.
Thanks so much. And before we close it up, I'd like to firstly, I think it's only apt that we're meeting today, the day after the New York Marathon, since we've had quite a marathon here. And so many wonderful speakers. On behalf of the speakers, let me thank you. On behalf of the participants, let me thank you. On behalf of my staff, who did all the real heavy lift on this, let me thank them. And of course, our co-host and co-sponsor, Ellen, and her wonderful group at INSA, let me thank them. We are adjourned. This has been a long day. Let me thank you for all that you've done, and hopefully, again, this is by no means the end. It's the beginning, and thank you. So, you're adjourned.